Welcome to STEAM Pod, where I have conversations with women in STEAM to learn a little bit about what they do and who they are. My guest today is Dr. Lucy Commander. Lucy is a consultant restoration seed ecologist who is passionate about Australian native flora and has worked with the mine industry on mine site restoration. She is currently the project manager of the update of the Florabank Guidelines for native seed collection and use with the Australian Network for Plant Conservation. Join us as we talk about her love of music, gardening, and her work with plant translocation and restoration seed ecology. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, so I feel almost like we need to have two separate sessions, one to talk about your translocation guidelines and one to talk about all the stuff with the seed collection and use. There's just so much to cover. Just a bit of background for everyone else. We were in the same year group in high school, and we even did choir together for a very short stint for me. But you just kept that going after high school. How big of a part is being a vocalist to, your life in general?
I just really love to sing, I guess. So after high school, I went and lived in London for a year, and so I didn't sing. I wasn't in a choir for a year, and stopped playing the violin and the viola. And I just really missed singing. So as soon as I came back to Perth, I joined a choir with one of our other high school friends, I've just been basically singing. I think. I first started singing in a choir when I was in year 5, and I've just loved it ever since. So it's just kind of for me, it's just it's relaxation and mindfulness, but it's also really energizing, and I love learning new things and listening to beautiful music, and also like being in a choir. I like making music with people as well. I'm not really that interested in just doing it by myself. So I really like being part of a bigger group and also part of a community as well. And then I'm in a jazz band now as well, so that's like really different to choral singing. I know I was really bad at the beginning, but I've been doing it for a while, so I'm getting better, I think.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. So you're doing both the choral and the jazz still at the same time?
I haven't been singing in the choir for a while. Since I had my second child, it's been a bit difficult for both me and my husband to get to choir practice at the same time. So what I do now is sing just at various events. Associated with the Royal School of Church Music, the WA branch, so I'm secretary for that at the moment, and so I sing at various events that they have through the year, so that's a bit easier to like go to a gospel music workshop, for example, and so I can just sort of still be part of the community, but just attend various events rather than a weekly rehearsal commitment because my husband's still in the choir. So
nice.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. And like just recently you took part in the virtual choir for Eric Whitacre's project too.
Yeah, that's right. So Eric Whitacre wrote a composition specially for the isolation times. And so for those who don't know, he's an American composer, and he just composes the most beautiful music. It's joyful, it's relaxing, it's like makes you cry. I think he's one of my favourite contemporary composers. We did a lot of his works in the choir that I have sung in. So when I found out about this, I was like, I'm going to try and learn the music and record myself. And the recording sounded terrible, but I think there's so many thousand people that it doesn't really matter. And it was just really fun to learn the music and be part of a choir with a conductor composer who lives in America that I would just never have the opportunity to do otherwise.
That's amazing. Yeah, and so timely as well, because I looked up the virtual choir and he's been doing this for about a decade now, just every few years putting out one of those ones.
That's right. And I think he sort of said that after the last one that they did that was really big, they were like, oh, there's not really a scope to do anymore. And then, of course, this came about and all choirs shut. And I was like, well, obviously, it's time to do another one. So
that's cool.
Yeah, it was great.
That's great. So there's no release date yet for when that's going to be out, because you only just recorded that last weekend,
right?
No,
I only just recorded it. No, I don't know. I think the production team will have to work pretty hard on putting it all together. So I don't know.
So there were about 5,500 altos, was it?
Yeah, something like that. It was crazy. Yeah, that's right. So it'll be in a cast of millions. So yeah,
it'll be a while yet. Lots to process.
Right.
Cool. And so we might come back to that later. So since leaving school, doing your overseas stint in London, you've now become a consultant ecologist. So how do you become a consultant ecologist?
I guess after I came back from London, so I got into science at UWA and deferred that.
Hmm.
And then I changed my preferences and enrolled in a Bachelor of Science of Horticulture and Viticulture because I wanted to do something a bit more specialist than sort of just science. I couldn't really see, I guess, where that would take me. And I was really interested in plants. So I thought, well, I'm interested in plants. I should study plants. So I did. So I did 4 years at UWA because it included a year of honours.
Hmm.
And then after that, I got a job in for Forest Products Commission working in their research nursery. So I did that for a few months and that was really fun. And then I got a job at Kings Park working as a research assistant in the seed laboratory. So for my honours project at UWA, I had worked on seed germination. And so I sort of had a few of the skills and a little bit of the background that I needed to do a research assistant job in seed biology at Kings
Hmm.
Park. So Kings Park does research on native West Australian species, horticulture and rehabilitation, general sort of restoration. So that was great. I did that for a year and then I kind of fell into a PhD program, as you do. And so my PhD was on mine site restoration and also seed biology. So continuing on from what I'd done for my honours and all the
Yeah.
techniques that they taught me at Kings Park when I was a research assistant. And then after that, I was doing contract research for mining companies, doing this sort of similar sorts of things, restoration ecology and seed biology. And I did that for about 8 years or so. It was just sort of a bit of a progression, really.
Yeah.
I certainly didn't have a career mapped out, just sort of taking every step as it comes and following up on new and interesting opportunities. So that's kind of how I came to be here.
And I guess because it's WA, you're going to have a lot of opportunities for, all the mine site restoration stuff because there's just so
Yeah,
much
I
of it
think,
going on.
WA is so interesting. It's such an interesting place to work in with plants. And I mean, I know a lot of people who do PhDs, travel all over the world to work. And I certainly have gone all over the world to go to conferences and collaborate with people. But I mean, our flora is just amazing. And we've got so many different ecosystems, from the kind of mountains in the southwest to sandplain flora to coastal vegetation. We've got river vegetation and riparian zones. And then also we've got the whole desert. So I've worked a lot in the desert, in the arid zone. And then we've also
Yeah.
got the tropics up in the Kimberley. So, it's just so interesting to be able to work in all these different ecosystems and work
Mm.
on different plants. So, yeah, I've been super lucky to have jobs that have taken me around WA to visit some really interesting and different field sites. And yeah, people come from all over the world to come and look at WA flora. So we're pretty lucky to be able to work on it here.
That's pretty brilliant. So, leading on from that, with your work in the Australian Network for Plant Conservation, you've helped edit the last set of.
The Translocation Guidelines, yeah. I started working for the Australian Network for Plant Conservation a couple of years ago, and they are an organisation that really promotes plant conservation in Australia, and they release various publications. So one of them is the Guidelines for Plant Translocation in Australia, and that has had 2 editions so far, but the last edition was produced some time ago, and so there's been a lot of research since then, and so it was great to be able to get some funding to do the update for that. So I was project manager and lead editor for that, and so basically the Translocation Guidelines is a step-by-step guide to translocation of threatened plants in Australia. And translocation basically means just putting plants from one place into another. So they might be directly transplanted. So you might dig them up in an area that's going to have a road or a mine site and then replant them somewhere else where they're not going to be disturbed. Or it might involve some sort of ex situ propagation or ex situ conservation. So you might collect the seeds in one location, put them in a seed bank, and then propagate them in the nursery, and then plant them out in either the same location. So you might be doing like a population augmentation where you're adding more individuals into a small population, or you might be making a new population in an area that's suitable. or you might be reinstating them into an area that used to have them, but they've become locally extinct. So that's what the Translocation Guidelines is focusing on, stepping people through all the processes you need from collecting the germplasm, so that's the seeds or the cutting material, right through from propagation into planning the site prep and doing the implementation, and then also doing the monitoring and reporting, as well as making sure that you have sort of Indigenous engagement and community involvement, and also getting the right licenses and things like that. So it's a really comprehensive set of guidelines for anybody who's working on basically saving threatened species from extinction.
This just covers so much ground there. So when someone starts a project, like say they're trying to build a new road, how do they go about assessing whether they're going to be ending up having to remove threatened species? Like, who do they contact and how do they figure out what needs to be moved?
Well, I guess usually before any sort of land clearing, there's some sort of process to make an assessment to see what's in the vegetation and determine whether there are any threatened species. I haven't been involved in a lot of clearing permits, but I think that is the case. And so then they might make an assessment as to if there are threatened species and they do get approval to clear, what they're going to do with the threatened species, if they're going to remove the plants as individuals, or whether they're going to, take germplasm, that is, take cuttings, or collect seed from them, so that the genetic material from that population can be stored and transplanted. So I guess, that would be sort of the first step, is to do an assessment, site assessment.
Okay, so do they work with like national organisations, or are they just small groups who will consult on these things?
It's really diverse, the people who are involved in threatened species translocation. So there are government organisations, like in WA, there's a conservation agency. So each state has got a conservation agency that looks after threatened species. And there are also NGOs that either own land and might do translocations on their own land. Australian Network for Plant Conservation is involved mostly through training and providing workshops and information dissemination and networking. There's also scientific organisations, so universities, for example, are doing a lot of research on threatened species, and they might be threatened species ecologists. So the ecologists are doing a lot of research and they're helping the practitioners with better ways of doing translocations. And then, of course, there are all the practitioners. So they might be community groups, they might be local land care groups, catchment management authorities, there might be local landowners as well, like farmers, for example, who might have translocations on their property. So, it's a really interesting and diverse mix of people that I've come in contact with through the guidelines. And then, of course, there's also the consultants as well, and practitioners, people who are doing the on-ground works.
So the Florabank seed guidelines that you're working on now, that's a part of the translocation process. So that focuses specifically on the seed collections and the getting the cuttings and things that you were talking about before?
Yeah, that's right. So the Translocation Guidelines were published 2 years ago now. And so the new project that I'm working on is an update of the Florabank Guidelines. And the Florabank Guidelines are the best practice guidelines for native seed use in restoration. So these guidelines, in fact, encompass not just threatened species, but also common species. So all species in Australia that are being used in ecological restoration. So, it basically steps through the process of seed use. So we start with species selection. So which species do you need for restoration? How do you decide which population to collect from? Because if there are multiple populations of a species, you might want to decide if you want to collect from all of them or just one or the local one, or, all of those different types of decisions. How to collect the seeds as well, because there's lots of different techniques for seed collection. How to dry the seeds, how to process them when you bring them back. How to check the quality of seeds as well, because sometimes you make a seed collection and then you find out they're all empty. It's a bit frustrating. Or also how to clean them up as well, to make sure you're removing all of the sticks and leaves and non-seed material. How to store them so that they stay alive in storage, because seeds, even though they look like they are kind of not really doing much, there's actually a lot of stuff going on inside them. So you've got to make sure that you keep them alive while you store them. So drying and storage is really critical. So we've got section on that, and then also how to propagate them. So how to get the seeds to germinate, what to do if they're dormant and they don't germinate, what you might need to do pre-treatments, and then also how to do direct seeding and things like that as well. And then we've got some top tips for people who are purchasing seed and people who are selling seed as well. So it's a really good update. The guidelines were firstly written in 1999. So there's so much information that, practitioners, research scientists, NGOs and conservation organisations have, really found out about Australian seeds in the last 20 years. So we're hoping with this big team of authors that we're going to help kind of communicate all of that.
So Florabank, are they actually a national seed bank? Their site's currently under construction, so it's hard to tell who or what they are.
So Florabank was a consortium between a few different organisations, but the funding ran out for them some time ago. So they're termed the Florabank Guidelines, but it's Australian Network for Plant Conservation who is leading this new edition of the Florabank Guidelines, but we're working with a whole lot of other organisations, so CSIRO and Greening Australia, and a whole bunch of other organisations as well across the country to try and update these guidelines.
Okay, jumping around a little bit because there's so many things to talk about. With the seed collections, do they go to national, like sort of state seed banks?
Yeah,
or is it still individual groups? Because it's the
really
volume that's needed for a lot of the things that's needed for.
That's right. There are lots of different seed banks around the country. So where I used to work in Kings Park, they have a seed bank there, and that's used for research purposes and also to propagate species for the gardens. In other seed banks, so commercial seed collectors also might have some sort of seed storage facility, and these vary depending on the end use of the seeds and how long you want to store them for. So if you only need to store them for a couple of months because you collect them, you clean them, you dry them, and then you're going to on-sell them, then they might have quite different storage facilities to seeds that might need to be stored for 10 or more years. So the conservation seed banks around Australia are in a network, and a lot of them contribute duplicate collections of their seeds to the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK. And that's an underground seed vault, I think kept at minus 18 degrees Celsius. So, duplicate collections of Australian plant seeds have gone over there for conservation.
And the seed banks that participate in this, do they only take care of the Australian flora, or do they also do food crop kind of seeds as well?
There are also seed banks in Australia that are doing food crops. And also, interestingly, they're starting to get into wild relatives as well. So they're looking at seeds and of wild relatives of food crops. So wild relatives of, grains like wheat and things like that. So that's quite interesting, where there's a bit of a crossover and collaboration between, the people who are working on native seeds and the people who are working on agricultural seeds. So that's really interesting as well.
So with, say, the bushfires, we learn at school that Australian flora works well with the bushfires, for lack of a better way of explaining it, because they use the heat fires, and from that it helps to kickstart their own growing cycle. So how do you assess or determine at what point these natural areas need the assistance and intervention?
Yeah, that's right. So, the Australian flora, some ecosystems are well adapted to fire. So plants have got all sorts of really interesting adaptations that help them cope and regenerate with fire. So, and some of them, require it, in fact, for their life cycle.
Yeah.
So some trees are able to resprout from their buds. They might resprout from underground tubers. There are other plants that are stimulated to flower after bushfires as well, so they require that cue in order to flower and then set seed. And there's others that germinate immediately after fires, because the smoke in the fires stimulates seed germination, and then they complete their whole life cycle within a few years, and afterwards, once they set seed, and the seed lies in the seed bank waiting for the next fire. So in some ecosystems, fire is required for some species life cycle. And also, species have really interesting adaptations on how they regenerate. But as you said, some ecosystems aren't resilient to fire because either they've been burnt too many times. So what might happen is if an ecosystem is burnt every year, for example, the species, they don't have enough time to be able to flower and set seeds. And so the seed bank becomes depleted. All the seeds are germinating, but there are no flowers and then consequently no seeds to be able to replace them. Maybe particularly young growth might not be resilient and they might not resprout and things like that. So certainly in areas where burns are too frequent, then the ecosystem may lose its resilience. And then others where they might be degraded. So for example, if there's been a lot of grazing through perhaps, sheep or goats or perhaps feral animals, then there just might not be enough seeds in the seed bank to be able to regenerate. So that's why I guess the first step really is just to do a survey, do a plant survey to see what's there, what's coming back after the fire, and then hopefully have an intact reference system that you might be able to compare and say, oh, we would have expected these plants to be here and they're not. So in that case, human intervention might be required. Sometimes human intervention might be required maybe just in weed control or maybe fencing to keep stock out, and there's no sort of active restoration required. But in other cases, the area may be so degraded that you may need to have seed input, and whether that's direct seeding or whether that's planting seedlings that have been grown in a nursery, that just really depends on the ecosystem and the species.
Right. So for the areas that keep getting burned every year, how do you help those recover? Because even if you have interventions, they're just going to get destroyed the following fire.
Well, I guess it does depend a bit on threat management and if you are able to control the fires in some other way. But it is a significant problem, and I think there are a lot of fire ecologists, and I'm not one of those. I'm a seed ecologist, so I study the effects of fire on seeds. So really, in terms of managing threats, that's really something for fire ecologists to help out land managers to be able to do that and try and better understanding of fire intervals. I think is certainly something that's really important, so that people really know, what ideal fire intervals might look like. Because some ecosystems might be adapted to burning every year, and some not so much.
Right. Okay. And so for the restoration of these areas, it's going to be a bit different for the ones for the mine sites. Where do they source all the seed to cover that much ground if they needed to actually do a restoration?
Yeah, look, seed sourcing is a massive issue. ANPC just put out a publication recently. It was a seed survey, and one of the issues is seed supply. Some people just can't get enough seed, and then they can't get enough seed of the species that they want. So a lot of seed is sourced through wild collection, particularly in Australia. A lot of seed is sourced through wild collection, and that can be really difficult because a lot of our ecosystems are already under stress. Like we've said, they might have frequent fires, they might have been degraded through grazing, and so they're already under stress. And also a lot of clearing has occurred, and in some places there just really aren't that many remnant populations to collect from, or perhaps they might be in national parks or places where people can't or have trouble getting permits to go and collect. So it is really difficult to source the volumes of seed required for landscape scale restoration. One of the ideas that people are having is to use seed production areas. So you can go and collect seed from the wild and then grow it under kind of crop conditions. So seed production areas are a way of, I guess, bulking up seed to then be able to use in restoration. So that's one option. Another option is just to get smarter about using seed. So instead of using huge volumes of seed, if you store it better, if you are able to pre-treat it perhaps, if you understand what the limitations are for recruitment in these ecosystems, then you might be able to use less seed because you might have a higher proportion of those seed germinating. So, a lot of research and field trials are needed to try and optimize seed use in the field, optimize storage conditions so you're not losing seed before you even plant it. I guess, look, scale of seed supply is a huge issue, and there are a lot of different areas in which the processes can be improved to try and address that.
Okay. So how much of, because, well, I guess there's a lot of stuff that carries between different areas. Is a lot of the research very specific to Australian flora, or is quite a lot of it still quite, I guess, transferable between other ecosystems?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there are a lot of general principles that the global restoration community is grappling with. So, for example, like, how do you define a reference ecosystem? A lot of these big questions people around the world are trying to ask. So, how do you go out and define, the targets for restoration? Which species do you want to plant, and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of those general principles are actually sort of talked about internationally. For seed ecology, there's also a lot of international literature. So, for example, different things that are able to, what seeds need to germinate, what different types of things will stimulate seed germination. A lot of those can be gleaned from the international literature or talking to people overseas. So in some respects, that's great. We're part of this kind of global community of researchers and practitioners who are trying to solve these problems. But then at a national and then also at a local level, we also have to experimentally determine those on our species. So while we can glean a lot of the general concepts from the international literature and talking to international colleagues, then you still have to do the work in the ecosystems and on our species to make sure that, it's tailored to our needs, I guess.
Okay. And with how diverse the Australian flora is, does that make it more difficult or less difficult to get that kind of level of detail that you need?
Oh, look, I think it makes it really difficult. Often when I was doing seed germination experiments, I'd be the first person ever to work on that particular species. And there are just so many species, in WA alone, let alone the whole of Australia, that, it is really challenging because we do have quite a big flora. So, yes, I think that is quite difficult. But, with that challenge, it also makes it really interesting because even like as an honours student, you can actually work on something nobody's worked on before. So, there's great opportunities for doing really interesting science and also doing really great practice as well in the field because, our flora is unique and beautiful. So,
That's brilliant. So how long is it going to take to put together this new edition of the Florabank Guidelines?
Well, it's about a 2-year project. So I started in October. So we're part way through drafting at the moment. We've got all of the modules drafted. We've got about 50 people from around Australia, from science and practice, government, universities. So they're representing the whole spectrum of the people involved in the seed industry. And so, they've been amazing in contributing their time and their knowledge for this project. So the next step is to refine all the drafts and get it published. And then after that, we're going to disseminate the information through workshops as well. So hopefully we'll have a national workshop and some state and local workshops as well to tell people about what's new. And often, people are really amazing specialists in their field. And it's great that the Florabank Guidelines are able to tell people about the whole seed industry. And so people are able to learn about other aspects of the industry that they might not already be involved in. So, hopefully when we're allowed to run workshops and do interstate travel, we will be able to kind of communicate that and educate people, but not just educate them. I think sometimes the workshops are really great because they bring people together, and it's often just those conversations over morning tea or over lunch, and people network and meet each other. You get a whole bunch of like-minded people in the same room, and, organically all of those kind of conversations start to arise. And so I think that'll be really good part of the project as well, is that kind of that networking opportunity as well.
Yeah, and because there's so many areas that it touches, it's just people from everywhere doing all sorts of things in the general sort of area.
That's
but
right.
They're all doing different work.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just a great opportunity, really, to be able to kind of give back to the community, both the threatened species community through the Translocation Guidelines and the seed community, and then supporting the restoration community. So everybody who's doing restoration, whether that's, tree planting or whether that's, on their local land, and volunteers as well. So yeah, I really enjoy being able to communicate new information and give back. But also I'm learning a lot as well, because, there's 50 specialists and they all have different areas of expertise and different experience to me, and they come from different parts of the country. So it's been great to learn from them. I'm absorbing a lot of knowledge as well. So, yeah, it's just a really great project to be involved in.
So many opportunities for just growing your knowledge in other areas that you wouldn't normally be touching. Have you encountered any work that's been incorporated into either this or the Translocation Guidelines where it hasn't been formally academically researched, but it's just anecdotal or just from experience from the people working on the ground doing the work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's lots of different ways in which people can communicate their knowledge. And so obviously the academic literature is just one of those things. So what we did for the Translocation Guidelines is we actually invited a whole lot of people to write case studies, and we published them in APC, which is the bulletin for the Australian Network for Plant Conservation. So we had people who were local landowners, volunteer groups and things like that submitting case studies, and they just wrote about what they did and what they found. And so that was a great way for them to be able to share their knowledge, as well as, just referencing things from the literature. So yeah, that's and we're also inviting that for the Florabank Guidelines. If people want to write a case study, then we're able to reference that within the Florabank Guidelines as well. And often we get people to present case studies at workshops as well, and that's really good because they are able to talk about their current research and don't necessarily have to wait until the whole lot is published, or they can present an experimental design or a field trial and say, this is our plans for our field trial, does anybody want to provide any comments? So I think, workshops as well are really great for communicating information, particularly, before it's, because sometimes the lag time is quite long to wait for things to come out in the literature. So, yeah.
Might start wrapping up this part, and I guess we can start talking about some of the extra questions that I've mentioned to you.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So what hobby or interest do you have that is most unrelated to your field of work?
Well, I guess we've already talked about singing. That's kind of unrelated.
Yeah.
So, I was in a choir for a long time, and now I'm involved. Well, I've been also involved in the Royal School of Church Music for a long time, since I was a little kid. The band that I'm involved in, I'm not sure how long I've been in that now. It's probably at least 10 years. Definitely music's a huge part of my life, and just really enriching. And I've met so many lovely people through it as well. It's great to be part of the music community in Perth. Other things that I like to do, I like to garden a lot, and it's kind of related. I do have a degree in horticulture, but I didn't specialise in vegetable crops. So, recently I've started to get into houseplants and tropical plants, and I actually didn't really learn much about them at uni either, so had to teach myself a lot about that. And I like propagating stuff, so propagate natives, I propagate tropical plants and houseplants, and succulents as well has been a recent obsession as well. I've got a lot of plants in my garden to keep me busy. There's always something to do. Teaching my kids a lot about plants as well, which has been really fun and also really rewarding as well, to be able to just do simple things like plant sunflower seeds and show the kids the whole life cycle of a sunflower within a couple of months, and watching them barefoot in the veggie patch, like just eating bok choy straight from the veggie patch. I guess I get a lot of joy out of that as well, just being able to watch things grow and be able to eat what I grow and sit under the shade of trees that I've grown, I get a lot of enjoyment out of that as well.
Yes,
So
definitely pretty satisfying being able to grow things in your own garden that you can eat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I certainly am nowhere near self-sufficient, but it supplements what we buy. So
Yeah, definitely. And it's good that your kids are getting so into it. Like my daughter was watching us in the garden and she was like, "What are you doing?" Like, "Well, we're planting things and then we're going to be able to eat them later." And she's like, "All right." And our snow peas started sprouting. So I've got her one of the snow peas, gave it to her, and she looked at it and she said, "What is it?" I went, "It's a snow pea. It's crunchy. You can eat it. It's sweet." And she just took a bite, looked at me skeptically, and went, "It's too crunchy," and then walked away. So
well,
clearly
yeah,
not as interested
my
as
daughter
yours.
eats most things from our garden, but she tried radishes the other day and she was pretty excited about that because she'd never had a
Nice.
radish straight from the garden before. And then she was just, the look on her face, she was like, no. I was like, okay,
No,
we
this
found
was
the
a
one thing in the
mistake.
veggie patch that you don't like. She'll eat bok choy and kale, but the radishes, she was like, no.
Too
So,
peppery?
yeah, yeah,
Oh well,
yeah,
she'll learn.
yeah, it's all right.
Next one. Which childhood book holds the strongest memories for you?
I read a lot at school when I was a kid, a lot. So I don't really have a particular book that holds strong memories, but I did read a lot of science fiction, I guess a lot of dystopian fiction as well. So I think probably John Wyndham is one of the authors that I remember reading a lot of, and George Orwell and authors like that. So I don't know if it's funny because often people think of scientists as non-creatives and maybe
Yeah.
people don't read fiction, but it's just totally not the case. But maybe that's a bit of a crossover, is that, I used to read a lot of science fiction. Now, not so much because I read a lot of science. So when I read
Yeah.
fiction,
It's real.
it's quite
Proper
quite
fiction.
different. Yeah, that's right. So I'm still reading a lot, but I think it was really good to read a lot when I was a kid. I think also one of the misconceptions I had about being a scientist was that I would never have to write. And I was really wrong.
That's all lies. It's all
Yeah, I
writing.
thought, you just write up, like lab reports, because that's all we used to do in science, was just write lab reports. I was like,
Yeah.
I can just write lab reports.
Just fill in fields. That's
Um,
it.
that's right. All you have to do is just write dot points and draw a graph, and I was really wrong. So I think, it's really lucky that I love reading because, now I have to read a lot for work and I write a lot as well. So, I'm writing books, I'm writing for websites, I'm writing for social media. I'm, writing a lot of emails, so communicating directly with people and lots of people across Australia and around the world. So I think, it seems like reading is fiction is unrelated to science, but in actual fact, it is. Also, I think one of the interesting things about scientific publications is people think that, maybe they could be a bit dry, and they're like, I just used to think they were lab reports, but then somebody once said, oh no, actually a scientific paper is a story. You need to tell a story. You need to be able to engage the reader, and you need to take them through from the familiar to the unfamiliar. And so, I guess, obviously writing scientific literature is different to fiction, but it is similar in a way, in that
Yeah,
you're
it's still a
telling the story.
narrative.
That's right, and you're communicating. And so I think, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it because nobody thinks about writing papers as being particularly interesting as a part of what they have to do. It's an obligation.
Yes, I
But
mean, some
yeah,
people spend, their Friday nights writing papers, or their Sunday mornings in bed writing papers. I'm usually disrupted by children at that time, so
yeah,
it's other people do, initially perhaps think of it as something that's formulaic, but in actual fact, it's a story.
yeah, it's great. Need to think about that more. And lastly, what advice would you give someone who wants to do what you do, and what advice should they ignore?
Well, I guess, firstly for high school students, like I didn't actually know that my job existed when I was in high school. I mean, I think I did year 10 work experience at a mine site, and I did do some mine restoration. So I kind of knew about this like mine rehab And I just assumed that you studied environmental science and then you did mine rehab. I didn't know what seed biology was. I didn't know you could study seeds at university. I didn't know you could do a PhD in seeds. I didn't know that you could travel around the world and go and talk at conferences and visit other universities and seed banks and things like that. So I think keeping an open mind and just following what you're passionate about and not thinking about things in terms of, what's your favourite subject? Like people used to ask that all the time.
Yeah,
what's your
and it was
favourite
such a
subject?
useless,
Like,
it was quite an awful question.
really,
Like, it
it's a
doesn't
really
help.
useless. No, I mean, and one of my favourite subjects was French. Like, and I certainly didn't study that at uni, although I have been to France. So. Yeah, I think it's quite useless. So I think a better question to ask yourself and also to ask others. Like, don't annoy high school students. Be like, oh, who's your favourite teacher? It's like, what are you passionate about? Like, what are you interested in? Is it animals? Is it the human body? Is it the weather? Like, it's like stuff for me. And for me, it was plants. I just really like watching plants grow, and I find them really interesting. I think they're really beautiful, and I just want to learn more about them, and I want to go to places where I get to see plants. So yeah, for me, that's what I find really interesting. And I like talking to people about plants, and I like writing about them and reading about them. So I think for high school students, definitely like find your passion, find what it is you're interested in, and go and just explore that. I'm also passionate about music, and I have no illusions that I'm going to ever get paid to be a singer. So, I still get to do it. So,
Yeah.
So yeah, find out what you're passionate about, and then hopefully if you're good at it, somebody might pay you to do it. And I think also don't stress about what uni course you choose, because really interestingly, the people who did horticulture and viticulture with me have gone into really diverse careers. So a lot of us have studied essentially the same subjects, but we've gone in all different directions. Interestingly, people who've done really different degrees to me have ended up in a really similar job to me. So I think while it's important to choose a course, whether that's at uni or at TAFE or whatever, that's important, but it's not like the be-all and end-all.
It's not going to be the thing that dictates where you end up.
That's right. I mean, unless you're doing a career that leads into, a job like, being a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, where you do have to go do a specific degree to get a specific job. The type of jobs that I've had, there's a diversity of different degrees that you could choose to get into that. So don't stress about that. Just follow what you're interested in and what you're good at, and see where it takes you.
That's cool. That's great advice. And side note, when you were in London, did you end up going to the Eden Project?
I have been to the Eden Project. I didn't go. I'm not sure if it was built the year that I lived there. But yeah, I went to the Eden Project. We took our baby son when he was little. He's now 6. But yeah, when he was about 4.5 months old, for some reason, he decided to go to London. My dad's from London, so we went and visit our family there. And we went to the Eden Project. So that was really cool. So the Eden Project, for those who don't know, is like, it's actually built in a disused coal mine, which is kind of really interesting for somebody who's got a background in mining restoration. It's a really expensive way of putting plants back into an old mine. And basically they've built these climate-controlled domes. So they've got a dome for tropical flora. They've got a dome for Mediterranean flora, which was really cool to go and see, Australian plants in the UK in an old coal mine. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting. It's really well laid out. It's really creative. I guess, gardening and plants is it's part science and it's part arts, because it's, it's creative and they just have really beautiful gardens and really interesting plants, and also a lot of interesting science to learn about different plants and different ecosystems. So yes, I have been there, but not during my gap year.
Yeah. So I went myself when I think they still only had 2 out of the 3 domes.
Oh, wow.
So it was really early on, and all of the plants, it was still fairly new, but some of the larger domes were like, I think the large dome, was the Arid dome. That was, quite well established. It was like, yep, seen that, know that one. But yeah, it's really good to see, and I would love to go back again to see it now it's properly established.
Yeah, I think West Australians, we often take our flora for granted, don't realise that actually people around the world, come here or go to the Eden Project to see our amazing plants. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's exotic for everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That has been really interesting, and yeah, definitely still feels like we need another session to cover so much of the other stuff that you've been talking about. But if anybody else would like to learn more about what Lucy does and maybe reach out to Lucy, you can find her on Twitter at Lucy_Commander, and on LinkedIn, which I'll be providing in the show notes, as well as through the AMPC site. So that's www.ampc.asn.au. So, Lucy, thanks so much for this. This has been amazing. And yeah, I've been well learned today. So, thanks so much for that.
No problems. I'm glad you found it interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you. As Lucy mentioned, Australian ecosystems are so diverse, and a lot of work goes into the conservation and restoration of these areas, and not just due to urban development and mining and bushfires. Honestly, I'm also now really curious about fire ecology, as well as the inclusion of wild relatives of food crops into the global seed vaults. Nerdy? Yes. Fascinating? Also yes. If you enjoyed this conversation, please let me know. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, and share this with your geeky, geek curious friends. Thanks for watching.